This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels in the furnace light of the Mesopotamian plain, where the date palms stand like sentries over the canals and the wind combs the grass to one direction for hours at a time. An old empire felt the sand slipping under its marble feet. The Sasanian world, heir to kings who wore crowns shaped like mountains and called themselves the shadow of God, had learned too late that empires do not die of a single wound, but of a fever that begins as rumor, then becomes famine, then becomes the sound of boots arriving from a direction no astrologer predicted. And in the year that memory would later number with a winds wind, the west burned at Yarmout, and the east began to tremble at al-Qādisiyyah. Boy king named Yazdegerd III ruled in name while his nobles measured the weight of his fate against their own hoarded silks. This is where our story opens, not with a clash of spears, but with a dread that comes to palaces before dawn, when the lamps gutter and the scribes wait for orders that will not arrive in time. Ctesiphon, the twin city of palaces and ports, on the Tigris, which the Greeks had scorned and the Romans coveted, breathed in a worried rhythm. The audience hall still echoed with the boasts of Khosrow II, who had marched banners almost to the shores of the Mediterranean. But the marbles also remembered the chains that bound him, when his own turned against him, knives flashing light. A new calendar that began with blood. The empire had survived regicides and regencies, queens who reigned briefly and generals who did not. But it did not survive them unscarred. Every coup peeled away a layer of loyalty, every emergency tax soured a province, every parade of elephants hid emptier granaries behind its spectacle. The Sawad, the breadbasket between the two rivers, remained fat with wheat and superstition, but its canals clogged unless constantly carved open by men who were now on the run, or conscripted or dead. And from the south and west, across basalt and thirst, came desert riders who prayed facing a cube and moved like a rumor at first and then like a plan. Tribes gathered under banners that were not negotiated in silk courts. Men hard from scarcity and scripture, convinced that the world had been reset and that old borders were a mistake the new age would erase. To the Sasanian court they were raiders, then pests, then a problem, then an army. To the farmers of Hira and the caravan masters of the Euphrates bends, they were a fact cheaper at tolls, cleaner in taxes, stern but predictable. And empires are never defeated only on the field. They are defeated in the ledgers, in the wells, in the promises that stop clearing with the coin's ring. Between these currents stood Rustam Faragzad, the kind of general an empire breeds when it remembers it must protect itself. A scion of the great houses, iron in thought as much as an arm. Carrying the old religion like a blade under his cloak, no need to flash it, only to know it is there. He understood roads and water and time, and that al-Qādisiyyah unremarkable node of canals and causeways. Near the western edge of the Persian heartland was where the invaders could be penned. Between thirst and marsh, where elephants could make courage expensive. He also understood court politics, which is to say he understood how orders can be written for one purpose and read for another. He was told to hold and to crush, and to preserve the dignity of the crown, to keep the invaders from the bridgeheads that led ultimately to the white palaces of Ctesiphon. And he set about obeying with the precision of a man who knew his margins were small. Across from him, not in front of him, because the two would never look into one another's eyes close enough to know their colors, sat Sa'd ibn Ablaks, a commander whose piety and patience were counted as assets no supply train could replace. He lodged, according to the chroniclers, in a high place where he could see but not necessarily walk, struck by illness. That made sitting a better tactic than writing. But on a roof a general can be a god, directing lines with gestures, and messengers, watching dust as if it were scripture. The army beneath him was tough and thin, not yet fattened by victory, still willing to share meat and dates along the canal banks, each unit stitched to another by kinship, and the certainty that this enterprise had been measured already in heaven. and would now be weighed by the earth. The ground between them was not neutral. There is no neutral ground in a land carved by water and old empires. The Persians stood with their backs to irrigation and cities and the craft of centuries, with elephants whose ears moved like sails, with cataphracts who thought of themselves as walls. The Arabs stood with their backs to a horizon they had never trusted, with light cavalry that could turn on a stitch, with infantry who sang in the night to steady their hearts, and in the heat that rose like incense from the reed beds. Each side waited for the other to commit the first arrogance that begins a battle. But this would not be a single day's work. The collapse of worlds seldom is. Our tale must move backward to understand how a throne becomes a rumor, how the execution of Khosrow to unraveled a chain of legitimacy, how generals like Sharbaraz could seize the crown with one hand, while the other hand still smelled of campaign leather, and how queens like Born tried to sew together what men had ripped, minting coins with a clear-eyed calm and sending reform edicts down the canals like paper boats that sank before they reached the fields. The boy king Yazdegerd III, the last Sasanian, learned to rule in rooms where adults murmured. His very name meant made by God, but the adults in the room believed more in arithmetic. The treasury could not magic soldiers, nor could fear summon loyalty from nobles who had been taught to measure survival by distance from the capital. Whenever armies approached, in that arithmetic, al-Qādisiyyah became an equation. How many elephants? To break how many lines? How much canal to anchor? A flank? How much patience before the wind turns in one's favor? Rustam gathered his divisions the banners of Miran, of Zod Spram, the armored men whose horses looked like bronze come to life, and arrayed them so that the enemy would have to bleed for every ditch, every dike. The elephants, towering and half sacred in their own way, would be pressed forward to drum fear into the ribs of men who had not yet learned how to unhorse a mountain. Drums beat, the canal edges thickened with shouting downstream. Barges were held in readiness to ferry messages, and perhaps men if the lines bent upstream. Riders watched for dust that might announce reinforcements or omens. And yet, if you listen closely along those canal paths at dusk, you could hear the other arithmetic at work, farmers telling one another which tax they preferred, soldiers confiding to cousins that they had seen omens in the flight of birds, muezzins folding a new sound into air that had long known only the crackle of Zoroastrian fires and the chants of Christian villages. Societies are not cleanly divided. They braid, and when they braid, loyalties blur. The Sasanian world was a mosaic held in place by mortar that required constant pressure, and the hand that supplied the pressure had trembled for years. Meanwhile, in Medina, a caliph whom later centuries would remember for his iron mercy read reports that came like whetstones, names of canals, head counts, the prices of barley, the request to replace camels, the letters from commanders about the state of hearts. He sent counsel rather than thunder, orders that were short, goals that were not grandiose but cumulative. Take the node and the roads. Do not chase pride, break logistics, not statues. And if night must be used, then use it as a friend you do not quite trust. What came to al-Qādisiyyah therefore was not only a battle, but a thesis about history. That heavy empires could be unstitched by light hands if those hands understood time. When dawn finally sharpened to a blade and the first sorties tested the grass and the nerves, even the birds seemed to hold their tongues. Messengers ran. The elephants moved forward in a rhythm as old as India, and the low chant of men who had memorized the scripture only a few years old began to pick at the confidence of men who had memorized a world centuries old. We will watch the collision unfold. Watch the lines bend and break. Watch an empire learn how quickly a map can become a memory. But first fix in your mind this question, the ache at the center of our story. When does a civilization die? On the day its capital is taken, or on the day its people stop believing the capital can be saved? That is the hinge on which al-Qādisiyyah turns, the sand on which the Sasanian world begins to drown, grain by grain, oath by oath. until the date palms themselves seemed to bow not from wind, but from grief in the weeks before the first arrow would hiss across the reeds. The story of al-Qādisiyyah was already being written in the quiet treacheries of court and camp. For Yazdegerd III, barely past the age when boys are allowed to ride alone beyond the palace gates, sat in Ctesiphon surrounded not by the loyal bulwarks of his empire, but by noble houses who calculated their loyalty by ledger, by ancient grudges, and by the private geometry of self-preservation, the Miran, the Ispabudin, the Sur, and all those great lineages who traced their blood to the heroes of Ardashir's founding days were no longer aligned as stone in a wall, but as stones in a riverbed, each lodged in its own place, content to let the current choose which to dislodge first. Ministers quarreled over precedence in the throne room while caravans brought rumors from the west that the Rashidun armies had crossed frontiers once thought inviolate, their horses, drinking from canals whose banks had only ever known the tread of imperial inspectors. In the bazaars, traders spoke cautiously of Hira and Alais, of skirmishes that had somehow become victories for men with no cities behind them. Victories that stripped garrisons bare and left Sasanian governors negotiating terms like merchants, haggling over silk. Even the Zoroastrian magi, once the sure voice of the eternal flame, found themselves whispering over omens, fire altars burning low in the night, temples receiving fewer offerings, the holy word still spoken, but with a hollow echo of habit rather than conviction. Rustam Farrokhzad, drawn from the safety of the capital to the rear of the frontier, read these signs as plainly as he read the river's depth before crossing. He knew that his army, though still clad in the iron lamellar and scale that had cowed the steppes and the mountains for centuries, was brittle under its veneer. The cavalry was proud, but its mounts were weary from constant redeployment. The elephants magnificent, but prone to panic if their mahouts fell. The infantry drilled, but resentful of nobles, who dined under tents while common soldiers chewed dates. And barley in the mud, discipline held, but only just. And every delay risked another thread of cohesion snapping. Across the plain, Sa'd ibn Abwaks kept his own counsel, measuring the Persians not by their armor or their banners, but by the cracks between them. His men were fewer, leaner, unencumbered by the weight of centuries, drawn from tribes that could subsist on a handful of dates for a day and still find the will to charge at dusk. They fought for a vision that lived in their bones, for words they had memorized in the night wind of the desert, and Sa'd's illness confined to a rooftop, where pain made his movements slow to nothing to dull the edge of his commands, carried by runners whose sandals were wet with the dew of the canals before dawn. Both armies, separated by the slow, oily gleam of the Euphrates-fed waterways, were engaged in a battle of patience before any sword was drawn, and patience is a weapon as sharp as any spear. Rustam was waiting for reinforcements from the north, for a signal that the Persian aristocracy had finally set aside their squabbling to face this new, unnervingly tenacious foe. Sa'd was waiting for the Persians to grow restless, for the desert-born heat to swell their tempers and dry their resolve. At night, the Persian camps lit with the yellow glow of oil lamps, shadows of war elephants swaying against tent walls like some older, darker omen. Across the water, the Arab fires were fewer, dimmer, yet their camp hummed with low recitations, the cadence of prayer rising and falling with the night breeze, seating unease among those who could hear it. In those nights, both commanders understood that what was coming was more than a clash of arms. It was the meeting of two worlds, one ancient and elaborate, the other raw but ascendant, each convinced the other was an interloper upon the rightful stage of history. And when dawn's first gold seeped over the plain, it was not merely light, but the beginning of a trial, in which the verdict had already begun to write itself in the hearts of men. In the first testing of nerves, the plain itself became a kind of interlocutor, answering each army's intent with a whisper of reed and a gleam of canal. And Rustam, who had learned to listen to ground the way a priest listens to breath, chose to speak first not with men, but with weight. He inched the elephants forward, at an amble that felt like a ritual, great gray fortresses crowned with bells and dyed cloth. Iron-tusked frontlets catching the sun so that every step seemed a policy. Between their legs marched files of infantry and lamellar that rasped like rain on pottery, shields painted with the old emblems of fire and star. And behind them the cataphracts and plates that made horses into statues, snorting plumes, hooves, beating a law into the soil. The message was unambiguous. This was the world as it had been arranged for centuries. Hierarchy made visible. Fear deployed as doctrine, and for a few brittle moments even the most stubborn men on Sada's bank felt their throats tighten at the dull percussion of that living wall. But fear is a weather that passes, and Sad, half reclined with pain on his rooftop and yet sharp as flint, sent out light screens, archers and slingers kneeling at canal lips, javelin men slinking along dikes with the slyness of foxes, and irrigation country to test how close they could gnaw at the edges of that advance. Before being kicked away, darts struck height and glanced, arrows feathered the mahouts' turbans, and the elephants tossed their heads angrily, flapping ears, like sailcloth in a gust. Then the first real collisions unstitched the air. Persian skirmishers surged to clear the banks. Arab lines rippled, small units folded back and then returned in darting counterpunches, the fight contracting and expanding like a living lung. Around each sluice and ditch, and somewhere amid the tight, brutal quiver, a veteran from the Najd shouted an old desert wisdom. Applied to a new battlefield blind, the beast and the mountain will kneel. And men began to aim for eyes, for ropes, for the gray ropes of trunk and the thin resolve of drivers. On Rustam's far right, a cluster of Bani Tamim horse tried a reckless wedge, were shattered by the iron hedge of spears, recoiled, then returned at a different angle as if to write in cursive. Where block letters had failed, on the Persian left, a standard dipped, a local collapse that cost nothing strategically, but whispered a superstition into the ranks. That perhaps the invaders did not fear magnificence, and perhaps magnificence could not command grain to appear in wagons already. Late, through it all messages moved like blood, sawdust runners with leather tongues, and precise briefs hold the canal mouths, harry their flanks. Never feed a full cohort to an elephant's appetite while Rustam scribes and marshals rode along files correcting drift, pointing the stake lines in the mud that marked where a flank would fold if an officer lost his nerve. Above the din the Dervish Kaviani hung with its encrusted inheritance of gems, like a condensed prophecy, and below it Rustam kept posture, a man who understood that battles were as much about the rate at which courage evaporates as about the geometry of lines, and that are the sun hardened, the reeds hissed, and the field took on the metallic taste of a forge. Both sides bled in careful coins rather than in notes, spending men to buy time, testing not just each other's steel but the psychology of formations, learning which units held when elephants pressed and which sang louder to quiet their hands. On the Arab bank, couriers from the rear whispered the first rumors of riders cresting the horizon, reinforcements, sent in increments, not as a boast, but as a metronome to keep the heart of the army steady and sod, hearing that a certain lion of the tribes had been seen driving his men in staggered packets, smiled without moving his face. He had asked Medina for patience and pieces, and patience and pieces were coming. As afternoon tilted, a thin wind drew a veil of dust across the center, and for a few minutes the battle became a set of silhouettes, elephant, spear crown, horse neck arsing so that men felt they were fighting shadow and sound as much as flesh. Then the veil tore and the center flared again, and with it a change of music. The elephants, harassed into rage, began to sway and stamp not at command, but at insult, one turning so violently that its howdah pitched, another lurching toward a canal embankment where nimble infantry vanished down the slope and reappeared behind it, with knives for the tendons of its hocks. A pair of Arab commanders, brothers whose boasting had been famous in the camp, but whose discipline now ran cooler than their reputations, coordinated a feint that pulled a Persian sublime forward into muddy ground and then scissored it, with a pincer of archers who had been told to waste arrows on no target but knees. Across the way Rustam adjusted, pulling cataphracts a file or two inward to stiffen the center, sending an envoy to remind the elephant corps that fear among allies spreads faster than among enemies, and that dignity, like a dam, must not fail all at once. All of which meant that even before the sun's edge kissed the western dust, the day had already given up its plan of being neat. What had looked in the morning like a procession of power now looked like a debate, and in debates, the side that keeps its breath wins. Water pots moved, prayer lines flickered like stitching in the gloom. The first long night of the battle approached, and with it the knowledge that some wars choose their hour of decision under stars. Men on both banks looked up and knew that the darkness would be loud. There would be calls, poems, countersigns. The low iron conversation of shield on shield dan yet beneath the den. The deeper dialogue would continue, the one that had begun before the first arrow, whether an old world could pull itself together fast enough to be one thing, and whether a new world could stay small enough to hit without missing. With night sought order, the lines drawn close to the canals, anchors in mud and memory, and Rustum, unwilling to concede even the appearance of retreat, ordered watchfires fat and bright, as if light itself were an argument that the gods of the plateau had not abandoned their house in the interstice between those flames and that water. Scouts slid and listened, counting. Accents, mapping the cadence of enemies' prayers. And somewhere in the tall grass a fox that did not know it had run between empires stopped to drink from a ditch where blood had already changed. The taste of the world that night gave way to a day that did not belong to either side but to the elements themselves. A sudden gale rose from the west, and the plain turned inside out, a wall of sand and small stone that clawed at eyes and mouths and the thin ranks of men who thought sheets of steel enough to stop the world. In that blind hour, the geometry of formations dissolved into a chaos of stumbling beasts and groping riders. Elephants bellowing with grit in their teeth as cords and howdahs snapped under hands that could not see, and Rustum Farrukhzad had stood like a promontory of command through the day, issuing orders with a voice used to being obeyed, was struck in that confusion by a violence whose particulars would afterward be embroidered by poets and polemicists until the truth wore many coats. Some said an Arab soldier, finding the great general half blinded by sand, cut him down where he crouched by a camel. Others claimed he was crushed beneath the tumbling load of weapons. From a startled beast, the Sasanian annals, when they dare to name a wound, speak of him found dead with countless blows upon his body, a mountain carved into a heap. Whatever the precise hand or the precise hour, the effect was immediate and catastrophic when the cry went up that Rustum had fallen. The ordered courage that had held the Sasanian lines together loosened like a rope left in sun. Officers glanced at one another and remembered grievances secreted beneath feasts. Provincial captains who had waited for the capital's command instead heard a rumor and chose their own paths. And where there had been a semblance of unity, there now was only a dozen different panics. Emboldened skirmishers pressed into gaps made by retreating squadrons. Elephants turned and ran into their own ranks or were blinded by targeted arrows and frantic knives. And men who had trained to meet the enemy in set formation now fought to keep from falling into the canal's reedy mouth. On the Arab side, the discovery of the general's corpse, announced by some who would remember the moment to the end of their days, was a clarion that changed the tenor of prayer into a chorus of triumph and grim purpose. And within hours, the Dervish Kaviani, that relic of myth and monarchy long stitched with gems and imperial claim, was seen as a prize to be seized. Whether it was snatched in the melee or abandoned as its bearers fled matters less than the fact that the sight of the banner in Arab hands turned a tactical victory into a narrative verdict. The Sasanian right, deprived of its heart, folded. What had been a disciplined withdrawal turned into a rout, with the Tigris bank slick with the footprints of men who ran for bridges and for boats, with some throwing away armor to gain a moment more speed, others drowning where the waterway swallowed them in the panic. Rustam's death did not simply kill a commander. It detonated the trust that had held the empire's disparate parts together, the oath between noble and soldier, the tacit bargain that those who fought would be fed and ferried and remembered damned. When a polity loses the bargain, it unravels in every province at once. By dusk, the Arab pursuers pressed to the walls of Madain and Ctesiphon itself, not as conquerors with a single triumph, but as the incarnations of an argument. The Sasanian state could no longer win. Oil and coin had been outrun by faith and mobility, and the canals that had once been arteries of imperial life were now the stage for last-ditch defenses and the desperate bargaining of governors, who wondered whether to sell grain to pay for peace or to use it to feed troops who might not return. When the smoke and scream of al-Qādisiyyah settled into the plain like a bruise, the war did not end so much as change shape. What had been a pitched clash with a single catastrophic event became a rolling collapse of will and supply, and the Arab commanders whose faith and lightness had won the field moved with a disciplined hunger toward the real prize. The arteries of empire, Ctesiphon, the twin city of Tigris marble and imperial ledger, did not fall in one grand thunderbolt, but in a series of negotiations, night bargains, and doors opened by those who had always calculated survival by distance from the throne. By the spring of 637, as chroniclers would reckon, the great bridges and palaces were no longer the confident stage of Sasanian kings, but a theater of bargaining where governors sold safe passage, where grain was traded for promises the state could no longer guarantee, and where the last boy king, Yazdegerd III, found himself reduced to travel and rumor, a monarch more often heard of than seen, a name carried between camps like a relic shaken loose from its shrine. The administrative machine, scribes, tax collectors, satraps did not vanish overnight, but it lost the rhythm that binds an empire. Tax receipts came late, heavy wagons turned aside. Troops billeted themselves with an eye to preserving lineage, rather than the crown, and local magnates made peace with a new order where it served them, or chose exile and bet on an eastern comeback where old loyalties might be reformed. In the bazaars of Madain, in the reed-fringed markets downriver, people counted losses in grain and in sons, and in whisper they tried on new names for their future. Some spoke of tribute and contracts, others of conversion and continuity, and still others of the deeper fear that their world, with its courtly etiquette and monumental arrogance, had simply been found wanting. The Arabs, for their part, governed with a dual instinct. One was theological. This enterprise was a mission that rewrote obligations between ruler and ruled, and the other was pragmatic, securing waterways, collecting revenues, installing garrisons and fortresses that had once been symbols of Sasanian might. Saad and his lieutenants, mindful of exhaustion and rebellion, sought to transform victory into stability, to bind conquered peoples into a fiscal and legal order that resembled the old one in many of its mechanisms, but not in its sacral claims. And thus the province that had paid to kings now paid to new men with new seals. Meanwhile, Yazdegerd fled eastward like a shadow retracing a coastline, carrying little but a title and a hope that Persians beyond the Zagros might rise, or the time would corrode the invader's fervor. He would continue to be the symbol of resistance for some and a convenient exile for others until his death years later. But by the time the Arabs pressed on to take the palaces and the granaries, the Sasanian polity had already been hollowed from within by faction, by fiscal sclerosis, by the exhaustion of frontiers, and by the slow betrayal of the very norms that had once made imperial command credible. Strategically, al-Qādisiyyah and the subsequent move on Ctesiphon revealed that logistics and legitimacy are sisters in statecraft. Without grain, without the promise of pay, without the rituals that convinced men their sacrifice would be recorded and repaid, even the most ornate armies become local coalitions on the brink of bargaining with opportunists. Socially, the conquest forced a reweaving of communities as Zoroastrian priests, Christian bishops, Jewish elders, and ordinary villagers negotiated their place under a new suzerainty that offered itself as strict in law but flexible in the local customs it allowed, so that in some towns life continued with only the names of rulers changed, while in others the very language of authority rewrote itself in months. And politically, farmers who turned their eyes to the next sowing season and a hybrid society that would, in later centuries, claim many of the old empire's glories while calling them by new names. A testament that the drowning of an empire in sand is messy and partial, and that from such wreckage new forms of order, language, and memory inevitably emerge. Beneath the slow arithmetic of conquest and accommodation, there unfolded another, quieter war whose maps were not drawn in blood, but in ink, the contest to preserve memory, law, and the tools of governance. And here the Persians, paradoxically, proved as inventive as they had been on any battlefield, repurposing what remained of their institutions into instruments the new order could not easily do without. Former satraps who had calculated that survival required compromise became the very men the conquerors leaned on to keep irrigation schedules, to adjudicate disputes over water rights, to read receipts and write mandates. And so the Diwana, bureaucratic skeleton that once served Sasanian grandees, wore new seals and names, yet continued to home with the same chores of grain and draft, the same petty litigations and weighty edicts that keep a society from unraveling. Meanwhile, poets and sages who had watched palaces burn retreated into libraries and caravans, carrying fragments of courtly verse and chronicles into refuges east of the Zagros, where, over cups of bitter tea and under the shade of walnut trees, they began to stitch the old stories into new narratives. And it is in that patient needlework that we see the cultural afterlife of the Sasanian world. Courtly Persian would survive as a medium of administration and literature, its cadences shaping the prose of new dynasties centuries hence, even as its priesthood lost its political salience. Religious life, too, rearranged itself in pragmatic ways. Fire temples shuttered, sometimes converted, sometimes kept for clandestine rites, while Christian bishops and Jewish elders bargained for protection under new emirs by offering continuity of service, local knowledge, and fiscal stability. In cities like Madain and Ctesiphon, markets reasserted themselves not as allegiances to kings, but as microcosms of adaptation, where languages tangled, Middle Persian, Syriac, and Arabic rubbing shoulders in shopfronts and courtrooms, and this linguistic layering would, over generations, feed the great flowering of Persianate culture under later regimes, a synthesis that bore the fingerprints of both conqueror and conquered. Militarily, the immediate shock of al-Qādisiyyah did not eliminate resistance. Pockets of Sasanian loyalists, remnants of horse and shield, attempted to stitch counter-invasions together, and tribal coalitions rose and fell in fits of courage and hunger. Commanders like Farrukhzad's kin led desperate sallies. Provincial aristocrats raised levies from mountain fastnesses, and more than once a governor's temporary success lit a small flare of hope among those who refused to accept the new order. Yet these rebellions faced a strategic problem the Sasanians had never fully solved. In their late centuries, without the central apparatus of supply and the sacral legitimacy that once turned levies into armies, such uprisings were often brave improvisations rather than sustainable campaigns, and the conquerors, having learned the lesson of logistics at the canals, methodically cut supply lines and co-opted local elites, until isolated resistance became a memory rather than a renewed state. Politically, as the Umayyad Caliphate consolidated power, and then, with the Abbasid Revolution, the center of gravity moved eastward toward Baghdad. Irony writ thick upon the map the inherited Persian administrative genius was absorbed and honored where useful, producing a hybrid polity in which Persian scribes and Arab governors negotiated the terms of rule. This was not simple assimilation, but a negotiated fusion. Persian administrative forms, like the use of registers, the bureaucratic hierarchy, and tax farming methods, survived because they worked while the theological and symbolic aspects of kingship ceremony, sacral kingship, banners like the dervish receded into memory and literature, becoming the subject of elegy and later historical imagination rather than practical statecraft. Culturally, the long game was winning for the heirs of Sasanian civilization. Their language and literary forms would, in time, find patronage in courts that had earlier been enemies, producing a renaissance of Persian poetry, historiography, and science that braided Greek, Syriac, and Indian learning with local craft. The very elements that the late Sasanian court had prized: astronomy, medicine. Courtly etiquette migrated into new institutions and were repackaged under different names, so that centuries later scholars in Baghdad's by Maristans and libraries would cite Persian physicians and grammarians as cornerstones of a shared intellectual edifice. Yet not all losses were recovered. The political theology that had invested kings with quasi-sacred power evaporated. The precise ceremonies, the rituals that turned tax receipts into cosmic order, could not be resurrected. For many, this was not merely political change, but existential rupture. A realization that the world their grandparents narrated in invocations and oaths had ended, and that memory itself would have to be the vessel that carried their identity into an altered future. In the end, al-Qādisiyyah's true victory was not just in the capture of a banner or a city, but in creating the conditions under which a new political grammar could be written, one that prized mobility, doctrinal unity, and fiscal pragmatism over spectacle and sacral kingship. And from the ashes of palaces and burnt archives grew a hybrid civilization whose bureaucrats, poets, and craftsmen would, in centuries to come, claim many of the cultural laurels once attributed solely to the Sasanians. The drowning in sand, then, was as much a metaphor for loss as it was an image of rebirth. Sand covers but also preserves, and buried under that shroud were fragments, laws, ledgers, lines of verse that would surface in new hands and new languages, reshaping a region that had once been the imperial heart into the fertile ground of a different, enduring order. Died in the slow calculus that followed. The human stories multiplied like tributaries, a magistrate in a river town who kept a ledger in Pahlavi and learned Arabic numerals because survival demanded bilingual accounting. A mahout whose elephant survived the frenzy at al-Qādisiyyah and thereafter would not bear a howdah, its fierce memory of knives making it too dangerous to parade. A group of young Persian poets who gathered in a burned caravanserai to read elegies and, between verses, barter for parchment and ink. These were the micro-histories that stitched the macro-collapse into a lived world. And they remind us that empires are not abstract things, but networks of obligations performed daily, strategically. The conquerors consolidated victories not by imperial hubris, but by administrative triage. Garrison the river crossings, secure grain stores, appoint trustworthy collectors, and above all, keep the roads open so that news and taxes could flow. This was the doctrine that turned battlefield success into durable control. For Persian elites, the moral dilemma was wrenching and intimate. Should one remain loyal to a boy king in exile, risking family and fields for the abstract honor of an old crown, or should one cut a deal, hand over a storehouse, and preserve the lives of peasants who had never seen a palace? Many chose the latter, not out of weakness, but from the practical arithmetic of stewardship. Nobles are also managers of people and grain, and the ethics of rulership include duties to keep communities fed. Their choices, judged later by chroniclers who preferred tidy narratives of betrayal or heroism, were in real-time negotiations about which lives to save. On the ground, the new rulers experimented with rulings that balanced religious doctrine and pragmatic tolerance. Taxes were collected with new formulas, sometimes lighter, sometimes heavier, often negotiated through intermediaries who could speak both legal languages. In courtrooms, judges trained in Islamic law sat beside scribes trained in Sasanian paperwork, and neither side won a pure victory, but both found compromise. Militarily, the old Sasanian methods, heavy cavalry, shock charges, elephant-led assaults proved devastating under the right conditions, but they required cohesion and supply lines the Sasanians no longer reliably possessed. The Arabs, masters of mobility and raiding logistics, avoided head-on replication of Persian tactics, instead using local knowledge, speed, and the political acumen to turn rivals into clients. Psychologically, the region underwent a profound reorientation. Where loyalty had been a vertical bond subject to king, new loyalties were horizontal and contractual subject to lord, governor, or community. Religion offered new frameworks of legitimacy that appealed across ethnic lines, and for many ordinary people, the change promised more immediate protections than distant ceremonial kingship ever had. Culturally, the encounter was not simple conversion, but acculturation. Art and architecture borrowed motifs, legal codes grafted techniques, and intellectual life became a mosaic. Persian scholars translated medical texts into Arabic. Syriac teachers fed Greek learning into new curricula, and the city schools that survived became crucibles for a cosmopolitan elite, who would later staff vast caliphate institutions. Yet sorrow and resistance remained. Pockets of Zoroastrian piety persisted in mountain valleys and hidden courtyards. Poets kept courtly memory alive in metaphors that masked political longing, and occasionally a rebel banner fluttered from a remote citadel, a reminder that the drowning was not total, but a long process of submersion and survival. In this layered aftermath, al-Qādisiyyah ceased to be merely a battle and became a symbol and event that later historians and storytellers would use to make arguments about fate, God's will, and the mechanics of empire, but the everyday truth was more prosaic and perhaps more human. The fall of an imperial order is measured less in a single decisive blow than in the weary arithmetic of administration, in the small moral choices made by men and women who preferred to feed their children rather than die for the glamour of a court, and in the stubborn persistence of crafts, languages, and memories that outlive crowns and banners alike. In the years that peeled away from the immediacy of battle, the subtle mechanics of survival became the decisive theater of history. Markets taught the lessons that generals could not, and in city quarters and village lanes the future was negotiated, not with banners but with bread. Merchants rebuilt trade networks that had been severed at the canals. Caravan masters reinvented routes avoiding bridges once controlled by palaces, and guilds reconstituted themselves around pragmatic needs. Potters, weavers, and smiths signed new patronage agreements with emirs who preferred reliable production to ceremonial display. So the daily economy stitched itself back together in patterns that owed as much to necessity as to memory. In private rooms, the great families argued philosophy as much as policy. Should one preserve the old liturgy of kings investing in fire temples and secret rites that sustained identity, but invited reprisal, or should one cultivate the new grammar of power, learning Arabic, entering diwans, marrying into families who could secure access to grain stores? Some chose exile, moving with their registers and household gods into the eastern mountains, carrying manuscripts and recipes, genealogies and grudge. Others converted slowly, sometimes devoutly, sometimes instrumentally, adapting rituals to new sponsors while preserving family memory in coded poetry and elegy. The intellectual exchange that followed the political earthquake was not merely a transfer of knowledge, but a recomposition. Persian astronomers and physicians, who had long observed the heavens and tended to bodies under imperial patronage, found patrons in Arab courts and hospitals. Their treatises were translated, copied, and discussed in new languages, so that the sciences became shared property of an emergent civilization, whose library is slowly filling with text in Arabic, annotated in Pahlavi margins, would later astonish posterity. The very idea of kingship was rewritten in salons and chancelleries. The sacral aura that had once circled a Sasanian monarch receded into elegy. Even as administrative competence, how to marshal irrigation, how to schedule grain deliveries, how to register land holdings gained ascendancy as the real currency of rule. New governors who learned to listen to local elders and to pay for loyalty found that authority could be cheaper and more durable than spectacle. Meanwhile, the pastoral margins still birth resistance in fits and starts and mountain passes. Small warlords raised shields and tried to rally provinces under the name of Yazdegerd, or of a noble lineage. These insurgencies were often tenacious and locally devastating, but seldom turned into a coherent restoration because they lacked what the old empire had once offered: a central treasury, a sacral magnet, an apparatus that could convince peasants, and the reed beds to trade grain for promises. The conquerors themselves adapted, learning that ruling an irrigated, urbanized society required paperwork and patience. They absorbed Persian scribes into their bureaus and retained tax systems that worked. The Diwan survived. Its seals changed, its ink altered in hue, but its methods preserved. And this bureaucratic continuity meant that for many villagers, daily life collecting water, paying a levy, arranging a marriage continued under different signage but with comforting practical rhythms. Cultural synthesis advanced in the kitchens and courts as well. Artisans trained in the motifs of Sasanian friezes carved new mihrabs and doorways that echoed the old geometry. Poets who had once sung incense and palace turned their metaphors to new patrons, their verses preserving old elegiac images that later imams and emirs would quote as if they belonged to the new world. Language, too. Braided Middle Persian phrases slipped into Arabic courtly speech, while Arabic administrative terms crept into Persian ledgers, producing a hybrid eloquence that would underwrite the literary renaissances of subsequent centuries. The psychological landscape altered, where vertical loyalty once defined a subject's relation to king. Horizontal networks of kin, guild, and patron became the operative moral economy. The moral dilemmas of nobles whether to risk sons for a lonely throne, or to feed villagers whose families had tilled their fields for generations produced choices, judged as treason by some and prudence by others, and these choices multiplied across provinces, effectively rewired the social contract. At the same time, memory hardened into two contradictory currents. One, a bitter nostalgia for the pomp and order that had vanished with palaces and banners. The other, a pragmatic celebration of survival, fields harvested, children clothed. Scribes at work, arguments that later chroniclers would compress into moralizing fables about the decadence of kings or the righteousness of the conquerors. Religion was a vector of both continuity and change. Zoroastrian communities continued in hidden courtyards. Christian and Jewish leaders negotiated protected statuses. Many ordinary folk adopted Islam for a mix of spiritual conviction and civic utility, for conversion offered new ties to rulers who controlled markets and law. But this was a slow metabolic process, not an instantaneous conversion. And for generations, households contained layered practices, prayers in the morning, secret rituals at night, so that piety itself became a palimpsest. Economically, the canals that had once funneled tribute into Ctesiphon reoriented into the arteries of a distributed polity. Grain flowed to garrison towns. Tolls were paid to local commanders, and marketplaces developed new centers wherever a secure crossing existed. Diplomatically, neighboring powers watched and learned. Byzantium, weakened in the west, recalibrated, sometimes negotiating truces with new governors, sometimes exploiting fractures. And Central Asian polities measured the shifting balance as opportunities for alliances or raids. Over decades, the cultural residue of Sasanian governance, its scripts, legal forms, fiscal experience, and elite education became the scaffolding on which new polities built efficient states. Administrators trained in Persian techniques staffed Umayyad and Abbasid bureaus. Persian chronicles fed historiography, and the aesthetic language of the late Sasanian court would surface in later royal ceremonies, under different flags. In private memory, the fall of the Sasanian order produced elegies that became canons. Poets and clerks wrote of banners like the Dervish Kaviani as if they were lost relics of sanctity, composing metaphors that turned banners into households, high-born deaths into harvest metaphors. And these images would shape a Persianate identity that embraced both loss and creative reinvention. In public practice, the new order proved adaptive, and that adaptability is the deep moral of the saga. Victory on a plain is only useful if followed by the hard labor of governance. If the conqueror learns to count the wheels in the mill and to keep the canals unclogged. Thus the drowning in sand was both literal and metaphorical. Sandstorms had physically torn men from beasts in a single day, but the slower submersion, the erosion of institutions, faith in palace promises, and the sacral center of kingship was the truer death of empire. Yet from that muddy, sand-smeared afterlife arose durable forms of civilization, hybrid and imperfect, that took the technical genius of the Sasanians, the doctrinal zeal of the newcomers, and the everyday resilience of farmers and artisans to forge a new order, one that would carry forward in altered shape the memory and some of the machinery of a once mighty world. In the long wake of the army's retreat and the palace's bargaining, a quieter theater of transformation opened where crafts, law, and memory did the heavy lifting that soldiers could not work that would, across a generation, decide whether the region became a mere annex of conquest or the seabed of a new civilization. Consider the scribe whose hand trembled at first when asked to copy an Arabic petition in an office that still smelled of cedar and ash, and who over months learned to hold to alphabets in his mind at once, to think in the grammar of Persian, record keeping while writing in the script of a new master, thereby turning the D1 into a bilingual engine that served both order and continuity. Consider the gardener of a canal town who negotiated water rights by bargaining with a local emir, rather than petitioning a distant shah, reshaping local politics around the immediacies of irrigation and harvest, and in doing so teaching a whole community the calculus by which authority can be bought, bargained for, or peacefully ceded. These micro-practices scribal bilingualism, water diplomacy, guild contracts compounded into macro habits, providing the scaffolding for governance that would outlast 1,000 pitched battles. In that reweaving, moral dilemmas proliferated and refused easy resolution. When a village elder signed a treaty that exchanged a modest tithe for protection from raiders, was he betraying the memory of a kingless past or saving children from famine? When a learned magus chose to teach astronomy under the patronage of an emir, rather than burn his charts and flee, was he capitulating or ensuring that knowledge survived to be reclaimed by future generations? The nuance of those choices was the substance of continuity. Militarily, the lessons of al-Qādisiyyah propagated fast into doctrine. Commanders who survived the early decades internalized the fatal error the Sasanians had made, over-reliance on prestige weapons without the redundancy of light, mobile forces and reliable supply lines, and so later armies, when they faced well-entrenched foes, mixed heavy cavalry with agile auxiliaries, kept water scouts always forward of flanks, and learned to use local guides whose loyalties could be purchased as cheaply as a sack of barley. In short, logistical literacy became the new sinew of power. At the same time, the iconography of kingship migrated into new artistic idioms. The Dervish Kaviani and its ornate emblems receded into elegy, but the visual language of imperial grandeur, arches, friezes, ceremonial robes was repurposed into mosque portals, palace antechambers, and the decorative vocabulary of new courts, so that the very aesthetics of Sasanian spectacle were not destroyed, but transmuted, their shapes pressed into the mold of new institutions that redistributed meaning rather than erasing it. Socially, the change was subtle and uneven. In some provinces, families kept Zoroastrian rites alive for generations in private courtyards, while outwardly participating in the public rituals of the new regime. In others, conversion to Islam offered tangible civic benefits, access to courts, tax exemptions, military posts, so that religious identity itself became a pragmatic lever, as much as a confession of faith. This produced a layered society whose surface rituals sometimes belonged to one religion, while private loyalties remained anchored elsewhere. A cultural palimpsest that changed the grammar of belonging and made identity a practice as much as a creed economically. The canals that had once been arteries of tribute became trade highways for a plural polity. Merchants who once moved goods under imperial license now navigated a mosaic of tolls and tariffs, learning to bribe or bargain, to route caravans past hostile checkpoints, and to cultivate patrons who could guarantee safe passage. Their ledgers, unusually meticulous, became the real historians of the transition, recording shifting prices, the disappearance of certain coinages, and the slow integration of markets across what had been imperial fault lines. Intellectually, the fusion would ignite a renaissance. Persian scholars did not vanish into mourning, but found patrons among those same conquerors, translating and synthesizing Greek, Syriac, Indian, and Persian knowledge into Arabic treatises that would travel west to Andalusia and east to Central Asia. In that synthesis, the mechanics of waterworks, the prescriptions of physicians, and the metaphors of poets crossed lines the belts of soldiers could not. Politically, the end of Sasanian centralized sacral kingship forced a reconceptualization of legitimacy, where earlier legitimacy derived from an allegedly sacred chain king. As cosmic guarantor legitimacy now depended on visible competence and contractual obligations. Governors and caliphs whose writ extended across rivers proved their right to rule by delivering predictable grain rations, fixing canal gates, and adjudicating disputes promptly. Such pragmatic legitimacy proved, in an agrarian society dependent on irrigation, more durable than ceremonial pageantry. Yet the emotional residue of loss persisted like a subterranean river. Elegies composed in ruined caravanserai, laments carved into the margins of legal documents, and oral histories that told of palaces lit for monarchs who never returned. These kept a distinct Sasanian memory alive, a cultural substrate that later dynasts would mine for rhetorical power. The long-term consequence was paradoxically creative. The drowning in sand, which in one register meant death, in another prepared the ground for hybrid vigor. Persian administrative skill, literary sensibility, and material craftsmanship survived and were integrated into the governance and culture of new polities, yielding a civilization that would later boast not only military success but also scholarly and artistic achievements whose lineage traced back uneasily but undeniably to the Sasanian past. And so, beneath the immediate narrative of battle and rout, a quieter truth emerges. Al-Qādisiyyah's significance is not merely that it toppled a throne, but that it exposed a structural mismatch the Sasanian splendid weight against a changing strategic environment that, when corrected by time, an adaptation produced a new political economy. That correction demanded pragmatic compromise from nobles, bureaucrats, clerics, and peasants alike. And those compromises, messy and morally ambiguous, allowed ordinary life to continue. History remembers the sound of banners and the fall of generals, but it is the slow, patient negotiation who learns a new script, who marries into a different household, who decides to guard the granary instead of following a fading crown, that sustains a people through catastrophe and seeds the next order. In that sense, the drowning was not a single day's disaster but a long, multi-year submergence in which institutions, languages, and identities were soaked, altered, and, in many places, born anew. And this slow transfiguration is the true legacy of al-Qādisiyyah, an empire's spectacular end fertilizing the ground for a hybrid civilization that would carry forward both the technical genius of Persia and the doctrinal zeal of its conquerors, creating an aftermath that was neither pure continuity nor absolute rupture but an uneasy and fertile synthesis whose consequences would shape the Middle East for centuries. Along the river of years that followed, history kept finding its way into the small, stubborn acts of individuals whose choices stitched the larger unraveling into a new pattern. Consider the royal scribe who, after the palaces emptied, took his cedar chest of parchment eastward and wound up copying tax rolls for an emir in a dusty chancery. His careful hand the living bridge that carried fiscal practice from a dying court into a pragmatic administration. Consider the silk weaver in a suburb of Ctesiphon who, deprived of noble patrons, learned to braid new markets by dyeing patterns that pleased not kings. But the burgeoning merchant class, these micro-transitions mattered because they were the daily grammar of continuity, the invisible labor by which an order survives even as its banners rot. Military memory hardened into doctrine, Nahavand, later called the victory of victories by some chroniclers, taught that massed honor without flexible supply was brittle. Future commanders, Persian and Arab alike, would design campaigns with scouts on every canal bank, with siege logistics planned like household budgets, and with the recruitment of light cavalry and auxiliaries who could thread arid country as easily as cats. This pragmatic hybridization of force echoed the cultural hybridization, breathing through markets and courts. The old elite's diaspora seeded institutions elsewhere, families that fled to the eastern mountains or Central Asian oases carried manuscripts and administrative habits that would fertilize later courts. They taught lawyers, translated medical treatises, and patronized poets who kept the cadence of Middle Persian alive until it could be recast, centuries later, into a literary Persian that would sing in courts far removed from the ashes of Ctesiphon. Religious life did not convert overnight, but layered, hidden Zoroastrian rites lingered in closed courtyards. Christian bishops negotiated protections that preserved schools and hospitals, and Jewish communities continued their trades under new seals. Islam's early legal and fiscal frameworks proved sufficiently elastic to incorporate local practice, and this legal pluralism tax exemptions preserved for certain communities. Local water rights adjudicated by compromise rather than command helped stabilize life where conquest alone could not. Artistically, the transference was visible in stone and stucco. The geometric grammar of Sasanian friezes reappeared in mosque portals and palace niches. The stylized tree of life became an arabesque, and the visual language of imperial spectacle was not erased so much as translated ornaments once meant to declare divine kingship were retooled to express civic status or devotional piety. The decorative DNA of a fallen court living on in new semantic clothes. Economically, the canals remained sovereign actors. Whoever controlled irrigation could command obedience. Pragmatic rulers learned to staff their diwans with men who knew how to read water levels and measure grain, and the survival of the irrigated landscape became the single most reliable index of political legitimacy. Diplomatically, Byzantium's cautious reparations and border negotiations, the shifting alliances of steppe polities, and the opportunism of local potentates transformed a single battlefield into a region-wide chessboard where soft power trade, ties, marriages, and legal continuity mattered far more than the flash of a lance. Memory itself became contested terrain. For some, al-Qādisiyyah was a betrayal and the Dervish Kaviani a lost relic, whose theft signaled the end of cosmic order. For others, it was a providential correction, proof that older tyrannies were washed, a way to make room for a more rational polity. Poets and chroniclers sharpened both narratives, composing elegies that made kings into archetypes and sermons that framed conquest as divine will, so that later generations would read the same events as evidence of very different truths. Importantly, the administrative genius of the Sasanians, their meticulous registries, their habit of numbering irrigation turns, their proficiency in revenue farming did not die on the banks of the Euphrates. It was absorbed, rebranded, and improved upon. And that bureaucratic continuity is one reason why cities like Baghdad later flowered into cosmopolitan centers. Persian scribes and Arab patrons produced networks of record keeping, an intellectual exchange that would feed libraries and hospitals, preserving medical, astronomical, and legal knowledge from multiple traditions. In private life, the moral calculus that once privileged sacral kingship shifted toward household and hearth. Nobles who once measured honor by banners learned to assess it by how many mouths they could feed through a winter. That pragmatic ethic save your kin, preserve your craft. Bargain for grain was not glamorous, but it proved durable, and its accumulation produced a new social contract that valued competence and predictability over spectacle. And so, while sandstorms may have physically torn men from horses in a single furious day, the truer drowning of an empire was a long, incremental submersion in which institutions were soaked, altered, and in many cases reborn. From the sediment rose a hybrid civilization administratively Persian, doctrinally Islamic, and culturally plural whose long arc demonstrates a painful but creative truth. Empires may die on the battlefield, but civilizations endure through the humdrum stubbornness of scribes, merchants, farmers, and poets who, in choosing everyday life over doomed grandeur, quietly authored the next order. In the hush after victories and bargains, another truth took shape quietly, but inexorably. Culture outlives flags, and the region's artisans, thinkers, and farmers refusing to be mere footnotes. And chronicles of defeat became the real architects of continuity, their hands and habits recasting the ruins into working towns, where new allegiances were learned by practice rather than decree. Consider the carpenter who, after the palace's lacquered doors were looted and carted east, apprenticed his son to an Arab patron who paid in coin rather than flattery, teaching the boy to lay beams for a mosque rather than a throne room, thereby transforming craftsmanship into an engine of social integration. Consider to the chronicler who, seeing his patrons change robes and names, chose not to let the old language die and instead annotated Arabic histories with Persian proverbs, ensuring that cultural memory threaded through new narratives even as political names shifted. And then there were the everyday bargains, marriage alliances between a once noble Persian family and an ambitious Arab commander that produced children fluent into tongues and comfortable into legal idioms, households that embodied synthesis. Rather than pure lineage, these were the domestic treaties that outlived treaties signed on parchment and sealed with heraldry. Economically, the adaptive genius of traders proved decisive. Merchants rerouted caravans, negotiated new tolls, and learned to pay multiple overlords without losing profit. Their ledgers, filled with columns of dates and measures, recorded an economy that had not ceased but reconstituted itself under different signage. And by keeping markets open, they undercut the logic of perpetual rebellion. Starvation is a better teacher than pride, and when merchants kept granaries stocked, the impetus for large-scale revolt diminished. Intellectually, the region entered a phase of creative absorption. Persian administrative know-how and classical learning, astronomy, medicine, legal thought encountered Arabic as a lingua franca of power, and in the crucible of translation and patronage a new scholarly class emerged. These scholars did not merely copy past texts but recompose them, inserting Persian empirical methods into Arabic treatises, annotating Greek ideas through Syriac intermediaries, and in so doing forging an intellectual synthesis that would later astonish the world. Politically, the long-term consequence of al-Qādisiyyah was the decentering of sacral kingship as a necessary form of authority. Legitimacy came to be measured in deliverable security of road and canal, predictability of levies, speed of justice, so that rulers who could not do desk work lost the chance to rule, even if their banners still fluttered. This bureaucratic valorization rewarded those who mastered paperwork and governance, often Persian functionaries who could translate imperial knowledge into practices useful to new regimes. And it is in this shift that we see the seeds of later administrative brilliance in Baghdad and beyond. Socially, identities layered rather than vanished. Zoroastrian rites persisted in private. Christian liturgies continued in communities, where bishops negotiated protection and Jewish traders maintained networks that crossed new political boundaries. Conversion to Islam, where it happened, often followed social incentives, access to office, relief from certain taxes, or the advantage of belonging to the faith of the dominant patron, so that religion became both matter of conscience and instrument of civic belonging, producing a mosaic of faiths and practices that characterized urban life. The arts bore witness to continuity through transformation. Sasanian motifs rearing horses, stylized palms, crowned figures did not disappear, but were recarved into mosque doorways, adapted into textile patterns, and quoted by later patrons who sought prestige without claiming the old sacral language. Poets who once praised imperial salons found new Masnavi meters and courtly forms under different patrons, preserving courtly aesthetics while shifting their address and argument. Memory, the stubborn residue of human experience, was contested. Fiercely in halls and marketplaces, some elders told stories of betrayal and lamentation, insisting that the Darash's theft marked the end of cosmic order. Others, pragmatic and weary, recited stories of bargains and survival, teaching children how to bargain for grain, rather than how to salute a banner. Both narratives survived, and their tension would feed historiography, theology, and poetry in centuries to come. Strategically, commanders across the region learned that mobility, intelligence, and supply trumped mere spectacle, and military institutions adjusted. Light cavalry and scouts were prized. Supply trains were planned with the rigor of a treasurer's ledger, and the art of co-opting elites, offering them roles in new structures rather than destroying them, became a staple of successful conquest. In households, the moral calculus hardened into a form of civic prudence. Nobles who chose to save their people rather than chase an exile's crown were later judged by history in contradictory ways, traitors to some, saviors to others, but their choices, multiplied, altered the course of provinces and decided which towns would survive famine and which would not. Such private decisions, multiplied across the landscape, were the true currency of continuity. Finally, and perhaps most poignantly, the Sasanian inn taught a lesson about the limits of spectacle and the power of administration. Great pageantry can awe and terrify, but only reliable governance, diwans that pay soldiers, irrigation schedules that prevent famine, courts that settle disputes swiftly keeps a polity alive. Al-Qādisiyyah thus stands less as an isolated catastrophe than as the hinge that revealed an older civilization's brittle reliance on ritual over resilience, and that, through its wreckage, yielded new forms of political economy and cultural life, messy, hybrid, often morally ambiguous, but enduring. And from that endurance would later spring poems, madrasas, hospitals, and libraries that carried forward the technical genius and human memory of a world that, for a moment, seemed to drown in sand, but in truth sank, mixed, and was reborn. Across the ragged years that dragged after the last pitched clash, the story of al-Qādisiyyah folded into countless smaller sagas whose combined weight decided the shape of a region more surely than any single triumph or tragedy. Yazdegerd III's flight eastward became a thread of tragic biography, a king in exile, a title carried like a litany, moving from caravanserai to mountain refuge, beseeching satraps and petty lords for men who would answer to a name rather than to pay. And his petitions were met with a math of self-preservation. Some answered with levies born of honor, others with grain and promises, and many simply closed gates and pretended the old world still existed while they hedged their bets, turning palace loyalty into familial strategizing. In the Zagros and beyond, pockets of resistance flared into short-lived campaigns that read like elegiac footnotes, valiant, improvised, ultimately starved of the central apparatus that turns bravery into sustained resistance. And these attempts, though often crushed, left behind legends and bloodied banners that regional poets turned into metaphors for fidelity and loss. Meanwhile, the conquerors faced their own existential homework. For a military victory that does not translate into reliable governance breeds rot as surely as defeat does, and so Arab commanders sought as successors and men who had learned. The painful arithmetic of canals shifted from the euphoria of conquest to the tedious mastery of bureaucracy, learning to staff diwans, to record water rights, to organize corvée labor, and to negotiate the tangled web of guilds and religious communities, whose compliance meant the difference between winner with bread and winner with graves. This was not a simple triumph of one culture over another, but a mutual adaptation in which Persian scribes found new patrons, and Arab rulers discovered the utility of Persian expertise, producing bilingual chancelleries, where lines of Pahlavi and Arabic ink crossed on the same folio. Socially, everyday life reconstituted itself in practices less grandiose, but more lasting marriage alliances whereupon families of different loyalties in a household, networks that could survive political storms. Artisans repurposed motifs of imperial splendor into the ornamentation of mosques and palaces under new names, and merchants rerouted caravans into corridors that guaranteed their profits, even as political flags changed above them. Thus commerce, more pragmatic than ideology, became one of the principal engines of continuity. Religiously, the transformation was layered and complex. Conversion to Islam occurred for 1,000 reasons: sincere faith, civic advantage, escape from certain taxes, but it rarely meant the immediate erasure of earlier practices. Zoroastrian rites persisted in discreet courtyards. Christian bishops negotiated protections that preserved schools and charities, and Jewish communities continued their mercantile networks under new seals, so that urban life often resembled a palimpsest of rituals where a morning prayer in one tongue might be followed by evening rites of a different heritage. And it is in that palimpsest we find the human texture of adaptation, prayer, and pragmatism braided together. Intellectually, the aftermath of al-Qādisiyyah catalyzed an exchange that would resonate for centuries. Persian physicians, astronomers, and administrators displaced but not extinguished tenured new courts, translating and transmitting Greek, Syriac, Indian, and Persian learning into Arabic. Their empirical methods fertilized a cosmopolitan scholarly culture that later blossomed in Baghdad's hospitals and libraries, demonstrating the conquest had an unexpected byproduct: the acceleration of intellectual synthesis when administrative necessity demanded expertise irrespective of origin. Militarily, the lesson hardened in the doctrine. Future generals, Persian, Arab, and others, integrated the mobility that had undone the Sasanians with the heavy striking power that had once given them their terrifying edge, creating hybrid forces that prized scouts and supply chains as much as shock formations. While frontier diplomacy, the art of co-opting rather than merely crushing local elites, became a standard tool of governance, politically the most enduring change was the redefinition of legitimacy. No longer did coronation alone guarantee obedience. Rulers had to demonstrate competence, timely justice, predictable levies, safe roads, unclogged canals, and those who could not perform these mundane miracles lost their claim, regardless of their lineage. This bureaucratic valorization elevated functionaries, scribes, judges, water inspectors into pivotal actors in a way the old sacral monarchy had not, shifting the epicenter of power toward the desk as much as the throne. Memory remained contested, and it was in memory that al-Qādisiyyah's symbolic afterlife took shape. Poets and clerks preserved the Dervish Kaviani and the image of fallen palaces and elegies that cast the end as cosmic rupture, while Islamic sermons framed the same events as providential correction, producing two historiographies that would be mobilized by later dynasts and ideologues to legitimate very different political projects. Yet beneath these grand narratives, the everyday moral calculus persisted: households choosing survival over spectacle, nobles choosing stewardship over nostalgic fidelity, and these granular choices, multiplied over provinces and decades, were the real author of the region's continuity. Finally, the paradox of the Sasanian end is that drowning and sowing often go hand in hand. Sandstorms tore men from horses in a single terrifying day, but the slow submersion of institutions baptized a new hybrid civilization in which Persian administrative genius, Arab doctrinal unity, and the stubborn resilience of local communities combined to produce a durable order. From ruined palaces rose new schools, hospitals, poetic canons, and bureaucratic norms that borrowed from both conqueror and conquered, proving that empires may be mortal, but cultural capacities, craftsmanship, literacy, legal acumen can be. repurposed to build something different, something durable, and in that stern, ambiguous endurance lies al-Qādisiyyah's deepest legacy, not merely a field where one banner fell and another rose, but the hinge by which an ancient imperial world drowned into the soil and, in its decay, made fertile ground for the civilizations that followed. In the long shadow of al-Qādisiyyah, the dust never truly settled. It drifted through centuries, carried in the parchments of scribes, in the proverbs of merchants, in the quiet prayers whispered in villages that once fed the armies of kings. The Sasanian world did not vanish in a single heartbeat. It bled into the arteries of its conquerors, its laws and customs seeping into the new dominion like dye into cloth. The battle's end was not an apocalypse, but a metamorphosis, painful, reluctant, yet inexorable. Where the Dervish Kaviani once fluttered above marble halls, now rose the minarets of a new order. Yet beneath their shade, Persian hands still carved stone, measured canals, and wrote contracts in the meticulous script of their ancestors. Yazdegerd's name became a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the edges of chronicles, reminding rulers that an empire's death begins long before its last battle. And yet, from that ruin, a strange kind of immortality bloomed. For in the markets of Kufa and Basra, in the libraries of Damascus and, later, Baghdad, the voices of Persia spoke again through the tongue of their conquerors, shaping the art, science, and statecraft of a civilization that would, in time, command half the known world. The empire that drowned in sand left behind no unbroken walls, no throne untoppled, but it left seeds, scattered and hidden, that took root in unexpected soil. And so, when we speak of al-Qādisiyyah, we are not only telling the story of how one world ended, we are also tracing the quiet birth of another, forged from the wreckage of the old, bound together by the stubborn human will to adapt, to remember, and to build again from the dust.